Hello, everyone. Good evening. I'm Richard Hackle, a board member of the Shebbig Island Historical Society. Welcome and thank you for joining us on Zoom for the Historical Society's Ellsworth Miller Memorial Lecture Series, established by Cap Leonard. The Board of Trustees offers sincere thanks to Cap for his continued support of the lecture series. Those who wish to support the efforts of the Historical Society may donate online at shebbighistory.com. But before commencing with the lecture, I want to acknowledge and honor the indigenous people who were first to inhabit Shebbig, forage its fields and forests, and fish its waters. Questions relative to the lecture will be addressed following the lecture. Please type questions in the chat box and select to everyone. We'll also try to bring everybody online with your video after the talk, so you can also talk that way. As previously noted, tonight's lecture, A Century of Portland Artists, 1820 to 1920, will be delivered by Earle Shettleworth, Maine's 6th state historian. The landscape paintings from the Maine Historical Society collections trace the evolution of Portland through its art. At this time, it's my pleasure to introduce Earle.
Fine. Well, thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to be with you at the Shebbig Island Historical Society. And I think we will launch right into the images. So if we could have the first one. This is just an introductory image, Maine at 200 series, A Century of Portland Painters, 1820 to 1920, and it reflects the fact that this lecture was first given at the Maine Historical Society by Zoom, because of course we're in the midst of the pandemic, February 25th, 2021. And it was this lecture that provided the basis for a book that was published the following year, 2022, by the Society on many of the paintings that you'll see tonight. Next, please. So Portland has this rich history from the 19th century of artists. And here we see landscape artist Charles F. Kimball, who was one of the finest of the painters. We'll see his work a little bit later, as portrayed by a fellow painter, H.G. Hughes, about 1880. There was a very strong tradition, particularly in the second half of the 19th century and into the early 20th century, of painters going out into the open air, plein air, and doing very rapid oil sketches of the beautiful landscape areas around Portland, and this painting is reflective of that. Next, please. But of course, the tradition starts much earlier. This is Congress Street, Portland, by Anna M. Buckman, done between about 1820 and 25. This watercolor depicts the original seat of Maine's state government. The vantage point is the corner of Congress and Myrtle Streets, looking west on Congress Street toward the present Monument Square. First on the right is a little two-story frame building, which was Maine's first state house in 1820, remembering that Portland was briefly the first capital of Maine, and that is located, or was located, where Portland City Hall now stands. Next on the right is the brick Cumberland County Courthouse of 1816, where the legislature met, and beyond the courthouse is the belfry and spire of the Old Jerusalem Meeting House of 1740 that survived the 1775 burning of the town, now the location of the First Parish Church. And at the left, the big brick building is the Portland Academy of 1808. This is a remarkable watercolor. Anna Buckman came from the Yarmouth, Cumberland area, and this watercolor was acquired jointly by the Maine Historical Society and the state of Maine at auction in 1998 to preserve it for the public. Next, please. Charles Codman was Portland's first resident professional landscape painter. Coming from Boston in 1822 as a military standard fancy ornamental and sign painter, he was encouraged 5 years later by the author and critic John Neal to make landscape paintings. Between 1827 and his death in 1842, Codman produced a variety of pictures, ranging from realistic depictions of the Portland area to romantic scenes based on the Maine wilderness and the White Mountains. His approach to nature reflects the influence of the Hudson River School of landscape painting. Next, please. This is a view of the entrance to Portland Harbor with the encampment of the rifle ranges of Boston. It's based on a hand-colored lithograph of Portland Observatory at the left on Munjoy Hill with the harbor in the background. This print was in turn based upon a painting that Codman did in 1829, and it depicts the entertainment of the Boston Rifle Rangers Company by the Portland Rifle Club, August 12, 1829. One of Codman's most memorable pictures, this scene reflects the popularity of local militia companies before the Civil War. Next, please. This view of Diamond Cove on Great Diamond Island in Casco Bay is one of several paintings of this popular summer retreat made by Charles Codman between 1829 and 1842. An engraving of a Codman view of Diamond Cove was published as a book illustration in 1836, resulting in many copies by amateur artists who depicted the scene in oils, pastels, and pen and ink. This was a reoccurring theme in Portland art all through the 19th century. Many different Portland painters followed Codman's lead in creating scenes at Diamond Cove. Next, please. Codman's dramatic depiction of one of the more than 80 shipwrecks in Cape Elizabeth's history reminds us of the perils of 19th century maritime travel, as well as the power of nature over man. Onlookers look helplessly at Pond Cove in Cape Elizabeth as a sailing vessel is swept against the rocks by the force of the storm. This picture is one of several paintings that Codman did on wooden panels that he saved from Portland's Old Jerusalem Meeting House when it was torn down in 1825. Next, please. Here we see Charles Octavius Cole, who was born in Newburyport, Mass., into a family of portrait painters who included his father and two older brothers. Charles began his career as a portrait painter in Portland in 1833 at the age of 16. For the next 25 years, until his death in 1858, he was the city's leading portrait artist, painting residents of all ages and all walks of life. He also painted landscapes of the Portland area and the White Mountains. In 1845 and again in 1849, Cole staged large public art exhibitions of works borrowed from local collections and fellow artists. Next, please. During Charles O. Cole's 25 years as a Portland artist, he painted many conventional head and shoulder portraits of local Maine men, women, and children. The Maine Historical Society owns 19 such portraits. The exception to the rule is Cole's 1849 full-length portrait of an elegantly attired 6-year-old named James Clark Burnham, seated under a tree in a rural setting. This masterwork combines the artist's skills as both a portrait and a landscape painter. The Society acquired the picture in 1920, and an elderly James Clark Burnham is said to have visited occasionally to gaze upon the image of his lost youth. Next, please. Our next painter, Charles E. Beckett, was born in Portland in 1813. He pursued a dual career as a druggist and a landscape artist. By the age of 21, he had opened a drugstore at Congress and Franklin Streets and was painting his first landscapes. During the 1840s and 50s, he made many pictures of local and White Mountain scenery. Here we see a winter scene by Beckett about 1845. This engaging scene by Beckett shows the Portland physician Sumner Cummings at the lower right in his sleigh, driven by his horse. A period inscription indicates that Dr. Cummings is carrying mail to Canada, which may be related to another Beckett winter painting, Furbus's Dash to Montreal. In February 1845, D.H. Furbish drove a sleigh from Portland to Montreal to demonstrate a shorter railroad route between the two cities than from Boston. Next, please. Martin's Point, Portland by Charles E. Beckett, circa 1850. This view of Martin's Point from the eastern promenade shows the Atlantic and St. Lawrence Railroad Bridge in the center and Martin's Point at the right. On the point is the Veranda Hotel, a summer resort that stood from 1847 to 1851. This painting is one of 27 views by Beckett that were used to make wood-color illustrations for Sylvester B. Beckett's 1853 Portland, White Mountain, and Montreal Railroad Guide to aid travelers on the new Atlantic and St. Lawrence Railway. And Charles and Sylvester were cousins. Next, please. For nearly 4 decades in the second half of the 19th century, Harrison Bird Brown was Portland's most prolific professional landscape artist. Drawing his subject matter primarily from local marine and pastoral scenes, Brown also traveled to Mount Desert, Grand Manan, the White Mountains, and Europe in search of inspiration for his highly accomplished oil paintings. Born in Portland in 1831, he started painting signs and banners about 1850, and by 1857, he had become a landscape artist, a profession he pursued until his retirement in 1893. Next, please. This 1871 oil sketch of waves crashing against a rocky coast is emblematic of the many seascapes of this subject that Harrison Brown made between the 1850s and the 1890s. On April 18, 1865, the Eastern Argus newspaper of Portland described this popular genre. Brown's marine paintings are purely his own, the style being entirely original with himself and to our minds superior to all others. He has given us the grand cliffs and headlands, the laden, hazy atmosphere, the green, hungry-looking waves in proportion to true nature. Next, please. This rear view of Forest Home, F.O.J. Smith's home in Deering, was made by Harrison Brown in 1881. The same year, Brown painted a picture of the front of the house that is now owned by the Portland Museum of Art. Smith, the owner of Forest Home, was a lawyer, politician, and entrepreneur who lived in this property from 1836 until his death in 1876. After he died, the estate was acquired by James P. Baxter, whose son, Governor Percival P. Baxter, donated it to the city of Portland for the park known as Baxter's Woods. The Forest Home structure itself was torn down in the 1880s. Next, please. This view of Persumscot River from Pride's Bridge at Riverton is typical of many pastoral landscapes that Harrison Brown painted of Maine and New Hampshire from the 1850s to the 1890s. In 1860, art critic John Neal described such a picture in a visit to Brown's studio. They are landscapes of pleasant inland scenes, rivers with living trees imaged therein, tractable by ever-lessening figures of foliage up to the hills, fields, pastures, with blue sky blending over all. Next, please. Born in Hollowell, George Frederick Morse moved to Portland with his family at the age of 4. He and his brother, the noted scientist Edward Sylvester Morse, received their initial art instruction from their uncle, Charles E. Beckett. George F. Morse worked as a draftsman and superintendent at the Portland Company for 44 years. From the early 1850s until his eyesight failed in 1915, he was a prolific avocational landscape artist, helping to establish the Brush and Painting Group and the Portland Society of Art, now the Portland Museum of Art. Next, please. This scene of Fort Lawrence on Fish Point at the east end of Portland was painted by George Morse at the age of 18 in 1852. Morse depicted the War of 1812 period earthworks with its cannon manned by two uniformed soldiers looking out to Casco Bay. Next, please. 18-year-old George F. Morse also skillfully captured the destruction of the American House in Market Square, now Monument Square, in Portland in 1852. From left to right are a corner of the Cumberland House, the City Hall, the Preble House at Congress and Preble Streets, and the American House, which is the building on fire. Morse dramatically depicts soaring flames against a black night sky as this large brick hotel is consumed by fire before a crowd of onlookers. And this would be in approximately the location of where the Portland Public Library is now. Next, please. George F. Morse's painting of the burning of the American House was but a rehearsal for the remarkable eyewitness depictions of the catastrophic fire that destroyed the center of Portland on July 4th, 1866. After moving family, neighbors, and furniture to safety, Morse painted 7 small oil paintings that recorded the path of the fire as it moved from west to east across the peninsula, leaving a third of the city's population homeless in its wake. Each view is a spontaneous record of terror. Explosions of color leap from the black shapes of buildings as frightened forms run piteously before the firestorm. George Morse later produced 4 larger paintings of the fire based on his original panels. These more formal works were acquired by the Maine Historical Society in 1927, a year after his death. And the first one that we're seeing is Commercial Street near the head of Richardson's Wharf. And in the left-hand corner is the burning and explosion of Brown Sugar House, which really fueled the fire as it moved from west to east. Next, please. This is a view of Middle Street looking west. And again, you know, these are just remarkable paintings. The brick commercial buildings on either side of Middle Street, the fire just like a great catastrophic cloud moving toward the viewers, and these crowds of scared individuals just moving forward through the street ahead of the fire. Next, please. Looking down Congress Street from Smith Street, this is looking now back down from the Munjoy Hill area into the Holocaust of the fire. Next, please. And here, the view of the fire from the Easton Cemetery. Many people went for safety to the Easton Cemetery, knowing that it would probably act as a fire break, and it did. And they basically spent the night with the fire basically surrounding the cemetery as it moved up to the slopes of Munjoy Hill and finally burned itself out on the morning of July 5th. Next, please. A little bit calmer is this pleasant scene of beech trees on Great Diamond Island, one of the countless pictures that George F. Morse made between 1860 and 1915 as a member of a group of Portland painters known as the Brushans, comprised of local business and professional men who were avocational artists. The Brushans devoted every Sunday, regardless of the season, to creating plein-air oil paintings of the Deering area, Cape Elizabeth, and Casco Bay Islands. Morse was described as, quote, a great nature lover who does not take liberties with nature, but paints the scene as it really is. Next, please. Now we move to Charles Frederick Kimball, who was the son and grandson of prominent architect builders in Portland. In his teens, he received painting instruction from the portrait and landscape artist Charles O. Cole. Between 1851 and 1863, Kimball pursued a career in landscape painting. After his marriage in 1863, he worked as a stair builder and cabinet maker to support his wife and two daughters. At the same time, he continued to paint landscapes of local scenes, becoming the most accomplished Portland artist of his time. Kimball helped form the Portland Society of Art in 1882 and was a central figure in its development. Next, please. Art meets history in this quietly moving painting by Charles F. Kimball of the graves of the two young captains killed in the September 13, 1813 naval engagement of the American vessel Enterprise and the British Boxer. William Burroughs and Samuel Blythe lie side by side in Portland's Eastern Cemetery, along with Lieutenant Kevin Waters, an 18-year-old officer who served on the Enterprise. This picture was given to the Maine Historical Society by the wife's artist after his death. He had painted it in 1876. Next, please. And here, interestingly, is an etching based upon that painting. Between 1880 and 1889, Kimball created 9 masterful etchings based on his paintings. In 1884, he produced The Graves of the Captains, based on his 1876 picture of the same subject. At the lower right, the artist included the following lines from Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's 1858 poem, My Lost Youth. And the dead captains, as they lay in their graves, overlooking the tranquil bay where they died in battle. Next, please. Charles F. Kimball's etching of Lock at Wyndham depicts a lock on the Cumberland and Oxford Canal, the inland waterway that transported goods and produce between Portland and Waterford between 1830 and 1870. When the etching was at the height of its popularity in the 1880s, Kimball's work was singled out for special praise by national critics. Next, please. Born in Portland, John Bradley Hudson Jr. received his artistic instruction from his father, a furniture painter and cabinet maker, as well as Charles O. Cole. Hudson began his career as a portrait and landscape artist in Lewiston in 1856, returning in 1858 to Portland, where he worked until the 1890s. He specialized in watercolors, but made special major oil paintings as well. He founded the Brush and Painting Group with George Morse and Charles Kimball. From 1855 to 1881, Hudson kept an illustrated journal, which is now owned by the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. Next, please. The Passumpsic River near Portland was a favorite subject for 19th century local artists, as we've already seen from the painting by Harrison Brown. And John Bradley Hudson Jr. was no exception, as is reflected in this 1867 painting of Passumpsic Falls. Art critic John Neal described Hudson's landscapes as quite remarkable for a sunshiny atmosphere and poetic truthfulness, cheerful, unexaggerated. Next, please. On November 16, 1878, the Portland Daily Press announced that Mr. J.B. Hudson has completed a painting of Simonton Cove, Cape Elizabeth, which is on exhibit at his studio. This large oil painting of what is today Willard Beach in South Portland is considered a masterpiece of Hudson's long career. Here, the artist serenely depicts the scene of a beach that once teemed with commercial trade and fishing activity. Included are 2 reminders of the recent Civil War, Fort Preble on the left and Fort Scammell on House Island in Portland Harbor. Next, please. This pen and ink sketch of Whitehead at the eastern end of Cushing's Island was made in 1875 by John Bradley Hudson Jr. to serve as the basis for a woodcut illustration for Edward H. Elwell's 1876 book, Portland and Vicinity. The Maine Historical Society owns 12 of Hudson's sketches for the Elwell publication. On September 11, 1875, the Portland Transcript reported that Elwell's new guidebook to the city will, quote, be illustrated with 73 engravings by sketches from Brown and Hudson. Next, please. Born in Portland, George Henry Bailey painted landscapes in the 1850s while working as a clerk. After serving as an officer in the Civil War, he returned to the Portland area where he became active in horse racing. His interest in racing is reflected in the many horse paintings he made in the 1870s. In 1878, Bradley studied veterinary medicine in New York and then practiced as a veterinarian in Portland until his death in 1905. Next, please. Dating from about 1850, this painting of a Portland light infantry muster, maybe in the Deering Oaks area, is an early work of artist George Henry Bailey. Between the American Revolution and the Civil War, militia musters were a familiar scene in towns and cities across Maine, and Bailey's picture captures the festive spirit of these military drills. This painting also reminds us of Charles Codman's depiction of a similar muster on the slopes of Mungery Hill in 1829. Next, please. 19th century Portland had its share of local characters. One of the most colorful was Tom Houston, a hog butcher known as Piggy Houston. In this 1870 painting, George Henry Bailey shows Piggy seated in his carcass-laden wagon amid pastoral surroundings. As an animal painter, Bailey gives as much detail to the Appaloosa horse as to its owner. When Houston died in 1870, the Portland Transcript eulogized him as, quote, kindly in his nature, and his well-known horse will be missed in our streets. Next, please. Scott Layton was born in Auburn and spent his youth in Gray, where he showed an early talent for drawing animals. In 1867, he studied painting with Harrison Brown in Portland and established himself as an artist in the city, primarily painting pictures featuring horses. About 1879, he left Portland for Boston, where he joined a highly successful career as an animal painter and a landscape artist until his death in 1898. Many of his racehorse pictures were made into popular lithographs, including 31 by Currier and Ives. Next, please. One of the most frequently reproduced 19th century Portland paintings is Scott Layton's 1869 winter view of Market Square, now Monument Square. The right half of the picture is dominated by the Old City Hall of 1825, which was replaced by the Soldiers and Sailors Monument in 1891. In the background on Congress Street are the First Parish Church and City Hall. In the foreground are two local characters passing their way on the square, Butcher Tom Piggy Houston with his hog-laden sled drawn by his Appaloosa horse, and the hunched figure of Squire Morgan, an attorney and inventor. Next, please. This painting of a horse is a fine example of the work of Scott Layton, who was celebrated as, quote, one of the most famous animal painters of his day. Layton's success as a painter of horse portraits is best understood by the importance of horses in 19th century America. Not only were they widely used for transportation and farming, but they were also the focus of horse racing, the most popular spectator sport of the period. Next, please. Born in Portland in 1852, Franklin Stanwood was adopted as a child by Captain Gideon and Elizabeth Stanwood of Cape Elizabeth. Franklin spent much of his youth sailing to foreign ports with his parents. Beginning in 1860, He attended schools in Portland and Gorham, excelling in art and literature. From 1870 until 1877, Stanwood is employed as a mariner on vessels traveling to Europe, the Caribbean, and South America. Between 1877 and his death in 1888, he worked as a marine painter in Portland and Gorham, also producing landscapes of the Maine countryside and the White Mountains. Next, please. What sets Franklin Stanwood's marine paintings, at least many of them aside, is their narrative quality. They tell a story. Franklin Stanwood's dramatic marine painting, The Slave Ship, captures an historic moment in time. As described by the Portland Daily Press of October 29, 1878, the painting, quote, represents a slaver in the shameful days of the African slave trade, escaping from a heavy British cruiser. The sharp, rakish craft, with its nearly every rag of canvas set, is audaciously confident, making her way across the range of the man-of-war's guns. The picture is strongly dramatic in its quality, as well as free but correct in drawing and pleasing in color. Next, please. Born in Boston in 1852, George Milton Hathaway grew up in Providence, Rhode Island, where he was trained by his father as a furniture painter and a landscape artist. From the 1870s to the 1890s, George Hathaway was employed by furniture makers in Providence, Manchester, New Hampshire, and Portland. And between 1893 and his death in 1903, he worked as a marine painter in Portland, producing large numbers of small souvenir pictures of the harbor and Casco Bay for tourists. He maintained a summer studio on Peaks Island and displayed many of his paintings at the hotels on the island. Here we see the bark Alice, one of his major paintings. From the end of the American Revolution to World War I, wooden shipbuilding thrived along the state's coastline and rivers, and Maine vessels traded in ports around the world. Proud builders, owners, and captains commissioned paintings of their ships for display in their homes and offices, such as this striking painting of the bark Alice made for Captain Care by George Hathaway. Commanded by the captain from 1886 to 1894, the Alice was part of the huge merchant fleet owned by Captain Jacob Winslow of Portland. Next, please. One of George M. Hathaway's most popular subjects was breakwater light, also known as bug light in South Portland, at the entrance to Portland Harbor. The Portland breakwater was built in 1855, and for the next 20 years featured a wooden lighthouse at its farthest point to guide ships into the harbor. In 1875, this light was replaced by a distinctive cast iron lighthouse based on an ancient Greek monument in Athens. Bug Light remains today a much beloved local landmark. And this little painting is typical of the hundreds of tourist paintings that Hathaway made in the roughly a decade in which he was active. Next, please. An Ohio native, George McConnell learned landscape and portrait painting in Philadelphia and New York, and furthered his training at the Académie Julian in Paris. Arriving in Portland by 1882, McConnell worked as a furniture painter until 1889, when he began devoting himself to landscape and portraiture. For the next 40 years, he produced a wide variety of paintings, ranging from postcard-sized oils to huge canvases. He supplemented his income by touring as a banjo player and minstrel. His showmanship extended to painting pictures in a store window in Monument Square. Next, please. This classic seascape of waves breaking on the rocky Maine coast is the matching mural to George McConnell's painting of the Pearl of Oars Islands home. These two large pictures hung side by side for decades in Mustaki's restaurant and candy store on Congress Street. McConnell painted these for Mustaki's in 1916. Next, please. This large view of the Pearl of Oars Island house was painted by George McConnell in 1816 as one of two framed wall murals for Mustaki's restaurant and candy store on Congress Street in Portland. The modest white cape in the picture was widely known as the home of the fictitious character Mara Lincoln, who was the Pearl of Oars Island in Harriet Beecher Stowe's 1862 novel of that name. For decades, Stowe's book captured the public imagination as a portrait of a vanishing way of life on the Maine coast. Next, please. Born in London in 1815, Elizabeth Murray was the daughter of Thomas Hepfy, a noted English artist who taught her watercolor painting. In her youth, Elizabeth painted and traveled extensively with her father, a British diplomat. While in Morocco in 1846, she married John Murray. Murray served as consul in Tenerife from 1850 to 1859, during which time Elizabeth wrote a book about her life in Morocco, Spain, and the Canary Islands. John Murray was assigned to Portland in 1860, and for the next 15 years, the Murrays were prominent figures in the cultural life of the city, and Elizabeth continued to paint her highly accomplished watercolors. Based on a watercolor by Elizabeth Murray, this colorful 1869 chromolithograph print features Dottie Dimple, a figure in the children's stories of Maine authoress Rebecca Sophia Clark, who used the pen name Sophie May. In announcing the publication of this print on December 29, 1869, the Portland Daily Press described Mrs. Murray's depiction of Dottie as a little country girl, 12 years old, whom the artist discovered in the White Mountains last summer. A blue-eyed rustic beauty who has put on a bonnet wrong side before and trimmed it with wildflowers, and holds aloft with a charming mingling of shyness and freshness a plate of berries to sell. Next, please. A native of Portland, Maria Beckett was the daughter of Charles E. and Pamela Beckett. Maria received her initial training as a landscape artist from her father. She first showed her work at the Maine Chartered Mechanic Association Fair in 1859, and many of her early pictures are of the White Mountains. Between 1875 and 1878, she studied with William Morris Hunt, the leading American exponent of the French Barbizon School of Painting. At Hunt's suggestion, she furthered her instruction in France. From the 1870s until her death in 1904, Maria Beckett painted in the style of the French Barbizon School. Here we see an example. A grove of trees is characteristic of the many landscapes painted between the 1870s and her death in 1904. Christian Volpe has written of Beckett, quote, a daring individual in everything she did. Beckett helped to blaze a trail for women wanting to enter the male-dominated world of professional landscape painting in the 19th century. And she did so while bridging the avant-garde French ideas of the Barbizon and its sister movement, Impressionism, in a wholly American context. Next, please. A lifelong Portland resident, Mary King Longfellow was the daughter of Alexander Wadsworth Longfellow and Elizabeth Porter Longfellow. She spent many winters of her youth at Craigie House in Cambridge with her famous poet uncle and his three daughters. There in 1866, she began her artistic education, which led to studies with Ross Turner at the Museum School in Boston. By the 1880s, Mary King Longfellow had become an accomplished watercolorist who frequently exhibited her work. In the summer of 1890, she painted on Monhegan Island, one of the first woman artists to visit there. This portrait, by the way, is by Ernest Wadsworth Longfellow, who was the poet's son and a cousin of the sitter, Mary King Longfellow. It's a beautiful portrait. Next, please. We're going to look very quickly now at a series of her beautiful watercolors. Back Cove, 1885, impressionistic watercolor that depicts the Portland Peninsula from Back Cove, and at the center of the picture is a silhouette of the dome of the City Hall. Next, please. Here, Mary King Longfellow's watercolor of a rocky shoreline on the Maine coast, highlighted by sailboats on the horizon. Next, please. In this watercolor, Mary King Longfellow leads us down a path in a dense Maine forest with light showing through the trees. Next, please. Mary King Longfellow was familiar with the sea, having traveled in her youth with her father, Alexander Wadsworth Longfellow Sr., as he charted the Maine coast for the U.S. Geodetic Survey. In this bright watercolor, she captures a scene of fishing boats on an open water. Next, please. This charming watercolor draws us down the back hall of the Wadsworth Longfellow House in Portland into the garden beyond. The back door is open, revealing the garden in bloom. Mary King Longfellow knew this scene well, for the Wadsworth Longfellow House was her ancestral home, built by her great-grandfather Peleg Wadsworth in 1785-86, and the childhood residence of her father, Alexander Wadsworth Longfellow Sr. Next, please. Our final artist is John Calvin Stevens, remembered for his distinguished six-decade career as Maine's leading architect of the shingle style and the colonial revival. Overshadowed by this professional achievement has been Stevens' lifelong passion for painting, which he began in his youth. From the 1870s through the 1890s, his work consisted of landscape and marine subjects rendered in pencil, pen, and ink, and watercolor. Between 1900 and 1920, he made many plein-air landscape paintings of the Portland area as a member of the Brush and Painting Group. Stevens was instrumental in the development of the Portland Society of Art, now the Portland Museum of Art, and the Portland School of Art, now the Maine College of Art. Next, please. Here we see Stevens pursuing his three passions in life: architecture, painting, and gardening. In this oil sketch, Stevens combined two of these interests in depicting his garden at 52 Bowden Street in Portland, where he lived from 1884 until 1919. Next, please. Known as Beckett's Castle on Cape Elizabeth, this picturesque stone cottage was built between 1871 and 1874 by Portland journalist and writer Sylvester Beckett. From 1874 until Beckett's death in 1882, the castle served as a popular gathering place for local artists and journalists. And this is Stevens' sketch of Beckett's Castle on a winter night in 1911. Next, please. And finally, we end with Stevens' lovely winter seascape of 1911. Snow-covered rocks in the foreground of this impressionistic winter seascape suggests that John Calvin Stevens painted it at Delano Park in Cape Elizabeth, a favorite location for the Brushans, the artist group to which he belonged. And so I thank you very much for going through the 19th century with me in terms of Portland artists and their works, and I'm happy to try and answer any questions you might have.
Yes. Thank you, Earle, for such a great presentation. Yes, if there's anybody out there, you can unmute yourself or start your video.
Right.
And
I have a question, Bill Danielson.
Sure, Bill.
Could you say a little bit about the Brushing Society?
Yes. And actually, Bill, if you want to come on, it would be nice to actually see you. Can you do that? Or
I tried, but I'm being told I can't do that.
oh, okay,
I don't.
fine. Very good. Well, then that yeah, I mean, I'd like to address you. There you are.
Oh,
Good.
there
Okay,
I am.
fine.
Okay.
We're a
That's a
liberal
little more a little
organization.
more personal. Very good. Yes. No. The as I mentioned in various commentaries, um, the Brushins was formed in 1860, just before the Civil War, by three young painters, George Morse, um, John Bradley Hudson Jr., and Charles Kimball. They were all basically the same age. They were born in the early 1830s. They all shared this wonderful enthusiasm as late in their late teens and early 20s for going out into the landscape around Portland and on the islands and so on and painting. And initially, the group was just that little core of the three artists. But in the post-Civil War period, it gradually grew. And from the 1880s until its demise about the time of World War I, it actually at times had a fairly large number of members, sometimes as many as 15. And their commitment, and we know this from the fact that Morse kept very detailed diaries of his painting trips for literally for decades. They're a remarkable document. That these men, who were for the most part not professional painters, they were avocational painters. Hudson might be an exception. Kimball was briefly, but they were from the 1880s, early 1900s, when they began to pass away. They were totally committed, no matter what time of year, to or the weather, with their easels and their paint boxes and their relatively small canvases, usually like 9 by 12 canvases, and painting plein air. They were not sketch artists, unlike, say, Harrison Brown, who took long sketching trips, filling his sketchbooks with ideas and then coming back to his studio in the winter and the spring and developing paintings from them. These painters were devoted to working out in the landscape, in the open air. And the goal was to start fairly early in the morning, break for lunch, and then work until the dark came. And the goal was for each Sunday to paint a completed oil sketch.
Wow.
And you can imagine how many paintings resulted from this. I knew members of Morse's family, his two daughters, one of his grandchildren, and so on. And the family literally had hundreds of his paintings, because he produced a new painting almost every week, from this process. It was remarkable. Um, and you had some very interesting and talented individuals involved in this club. People would go in and out, they'd join and then they'd leave and so on. But they included not only the three core members who were active from the 1860s to the early 1900s, but also, of course, the artist architect John Calvin Stevens. There was a man named Edward Suffolk Griffin, who was a master ship carver, figurehead carver, but he was also a fine artist. And his son, Walter Griffin, who became a very important American impressionist, actually had his start in his teens with this group, and so on. It's a very interesting culture that they created.
Well, that's wonderful. Thank you for that
And
detail.
and as I touched upon when I talked about the different artists, you actually have Morse and Kimball and Hudson and Stevens and two or three other of these fellows are among the core members of the of the founding of the Portland Society of Art in 1882. And Stevens plays a major role in the development of what is now the Portland Museum of Art, because they initially built a wonderful little clubhouse building where they could exhibit their works, and they also taught painting classes and sketching classes. And that little building lasted only about 15 years. And then unfortunately, it was removed because the old Baxter Library wanted to expand behind the original building. And so the Portland Society of Art lost its clubhouse. And there was a period there when it looked like the Portland Society of Art might just phase out. But John Calvin Stevens did not give up. And he found Mrs. Margaret Jane Muzzy Sweat, who became the donor of the Art Museum and the McClellan House.
Thank you so much for that. That was wonderful.
Right.
The entire presentation.
Sorry to rattle on.
That's all right. The entire presentation was just wonderful. You've just informed us so much. I'm just amazed at the variety of different paintings and styles that that come along. I don't know if Esther has anything that you'd like to ask.
No, I've been sort of thinking that Richard Hackle could go around and take some photographs of some of the same locations. Compare them with.
Okay.
That would be fun.
There's an assignment. I should add a footnote too. I was out this summer a couple times, and Donna Damon showed me the paintings that actually are right on the screen in the upper left in the background on the wall, that the Society is collecting. And I think it's wonderful that you're among the many great things that the Society does, that you are cultivating a collection of art that represents Shebbig Island. And one of the Hamilton family did small tourist paintings, very similar to what Hathaway was doing. And Donna showed those to me, and we had great discussion of them. And then she did some further research and shared it with me. And it turns out, and not surprisingly, that Mr. Hamilton from Shebbig Island actually trained under George Hathaway, because the work is very similar in scale, in subject matter, and in purpose. And when Hathaway died in 1903, it looks to me like Hamilton picked up where he left off and continued to work another decade or so, producing these beautifully detailed paintings of views of Casco Bay that were sold to the summer tourists. And you've collected several of them, both oils and watercolors, and hey,
Yes.
there just couldn't be a more interesting pursuit.
Alrighty.
Yes, we have Jill asking.
Yeah, so
yes.
Earle,
Go
once
ahead.
again, thanks very much. Incredibly informative and fascinating. I have both a question and then a comment. I'll make the comment first so that you can then answer the question. So having
Okay.
trained as a geologist, I love seeing these paintings that show what the landscape looked like at a time in the past. And geologists often go back to those same locations of paintings and take photographs to document the change in the geologic landscape over time. And you certainly talk about that in terms of the cityscape, but I just find it fascinating from the...
Oh, well, your point, Jill, is very well taken. As you know, as a geologist, the 19th century, both in America, England, and Europe, is the period of the sort of great awakening of knowledge about geology. And not that people weren't studying it before, but just for example, here in Maine, you have Parker Cleveland, who's Harvard educated, who comes to Bowdoin in the first years of the 19th century. And among his various scientific pursuits, he studies and teaches geology. and publishes the first American work on geology, coming out of Maine in the fairly early 19th century. There was a great deal of interplay of interest between the scientific study and awakening of interest in geology and the use of geologic formations, particularly rock formations, in the work of 19th century painters. There's a real affinity there. And your point also about how these early paintings and also early photographs of landscape and seascape are important records for us to go back to and compare current conditions. I've been working with the Bowdoin College Museum of Art on a very interesting project in which it'll open as an exhibit in late 2024, run through the spring of 2025, and then go out to the Monhegan Museum. And that is approaching the art and photography of Monhegan from the standpoint of the changing environment. And the photographic and art record goes back to between 150 and 175 years. And Barry Logan, who is one of the scientists at Bowdoin, is really championed this idea of using the image record to then explain the environmental evolution of the island over the last 175 years. And I think it's a really neat concept. And it will appear both as an exhibit, and there will also be a major book catalog dealing with the issue.
Oh, that's great.
So it's the
Wow.
combination of art and science, really.
That's right. I made a note on that. So my question is about those incredible paintings of the Great Fire.
Oh, yes.
I think you said those were the ones that he painted later.
That's right. That's right.
And they had such incredible detail in the original ones that he sort of painted at the time. Were they less detailed?
Yeah, they were very small. They were just little panels. I can't remember whether they were wood or whether they were cardboard, artist board panels. Sadly, those turned up at some point back in I think it was in the late 20th century. Now we're talking about the late 20th century. And they were owned by F.O. Bailey for a while. They were on loan to the Portland Museum of Art. And then sadly they got sold. And when the 150th anniversary of the fire came up a few years ago, we tried in earnest to find them, and they're in some private collection somewhere, but they're really city and state treasures. But we do have photographs of them. And they were, number one, they were much smaller than the four oils that Morse ultimately did from them based on the sketches. And number two, you're absolutely right. They were very rapidly done. They literally were oil sketches of his immediate impressions of different sections of the city burning. And then at a later point, we're not exactly sure when, he decided to develop 4 out of those 7 panels into larger, more finished paintings with more detail that ultimately ended up at the Maine Historical Society. And those are the paintings you saw tonight. But boy, I would love to find the originals, because it would be fascinating to be able to compare the actual paintings with the actual larger paintings.
It's a little terrifying to think that he took time to paint as people were
Oh God, yes. Yeah, no, it's amazing, really. He does assure us in his memoirs that he took care of his family first.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, yeah, great. So I guess thanks again, Earle, if there aren't any more questions. Thanks again for giving this talk, and it was great stuff. So we're the lecture series is skipping over the Christmas holidays. We will not have a lecture in December, but we will be back in January 22nd at 7 p.m. with Donna Damon, who will be our lecturer then. So we're going to do that.
Yeah.
So thanks everyone for tuning in.
Thank
and
you.
Thanks
showing
again,
up.
Earl.
Okay.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
And we'll see you next time. Great. Good night.
You bet.